The ballroom of Blackwell Hall had never looked more beautiful than it did that night. Gold chandeliers blazed above polished marble floors. Candlelight caught the crystal glasses that servants carried on silver trays, scattering tiny diamonds of light across silk gowns and powdered shoulders. Musicians played from the upper gallery, something sweet and low, the kind of melody that makes a room feel like a dream, and the laughter of England's finest floated up into the vaulted ceiling like smoke from 100 perfumed candles. It was the 21st anniversary of the Duke and Duchess of Blackwell, 21 years, and Louisa Hawthorne, Louisa Blackwell, she reminded herself, though the name had never felt entirely like her own, stood beside her husband near the grand staircase and told herself that tonight was different, that Desmond had planned something, that the distance between them these past months had only been stress, politics, the weight of a great estate pressing down on a great man. She had explained it away so many times that she had nearly convinced herself the explanations were true. Louisa wore silver blue silk that evening, simple, graceful, chosen because Desmond had once told her, years ago, that she looked like winter moonlight in that color. Around her throat rested the Blackwell sapphire necklace, a single deep blue stone surrounded by smaller diamonds, passed down through 4 generations of Blackwell duchesses. She had worn it on her wedding day. She had worn it to every important evening since. She touched it now, just lightly, the way a person touches something they are about to lose without knowing it. Across the room, Lady Violette Kensington stood near the front of the assembled crowd in a gown of pale rose silk. She was young. She was beautiful. Her dark hair was dressed high, and her skin glowed with the confidence of a woman who believed the room had been designed entirely for her pleasure. Several gentlemen had already positioned themselves closer to her than propriety strictly required. She smiled easily, laughed softly, and moved through the ballroom as though she already owned it. Louisa had noticed her the moment she arrived. She had noticed, too, the way Desmond's gaze found Violette whenever he thought Louisa was occupied with conversation. She had noticed. She had simply chosen not to name what she was seeing. Some things, once named, cannot be unlearned. The musicians drew their melody to a close. Desmond stepped forward. He was still a handsome man, tall, broad-shouldered, with grey beginning to silver at his temples in a way that society declared distinguished. He wore his title the way some men wore armor, as though it were a second skin, as though he could not remember what lay beneath. He raised his glass, and the room fell into a silence so complete that Louisa could hear the candles hiss. She straightened. She smiled. She prepared to receive whatever words he had planned, whatever tribute, however brief, however perfunctory. "England has been kind to me," Desmond began, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd. "Kind enough to give me this estate, this title, and years of significant comfort." Louisa waited. But a great estate requires a future. A great name requires new life. And I have come to understand, as many of you already know, that what was once built cannot always sustain what is still to come. Something in Louisa's chest went very still. She heard a fan snap shut somewhere behind her. She heard a glass set down, carefully, on a tray. She heard a woman near the fireplace draw a slow breath. "Lady Violette Kensington," Desmond said, and his voice warmed on the name in a way it had not warmed on anything in years, "has agreed to stand beside me as the next Duchess of Blackwell. Our arrangement with the church will be formalized within the month." The ballroom did not erupt. It exhaled, a soft, collective sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a murmur, moved through the room like a cold draught under a door. People turned to look at Louisa, then looked quickly away. Some pressed their lips together. Some found the ceiling very interesting. Lady Adelaide Prescott, near the fireplace, brought a gloved hand to her chest. Lord Augustus Carrington, standing to the left of the staircase, went very still. Sir Benedict Stirling stared at Desmond with something close to disgust, though he said nothing. No one said anything. And Desmond did not look at Louisa at all. That was the thing she would remember later. Not what he said, Not the words that stripped 21 years into a public announcement. Not the way Violette received the attention of the room with such practiced modesty that it could only have been rehearsed. It was that he did not look at her, not once, as though she were already a woman who had already left. Louisa's hands, folded in front of her, were very calm. She was aware of that calmness in a distant way, the way a person who has walked into very cold water becomes aware of it only after the first shock has already passed. She reached up to her throat. Her fingers found the clasp of the Blackwell sapphire necklace. They worked it loose with the steadiness of long practice, the way they had managed estate ledgers at midnight and soothed weeping tenants at dawn, and written letters of polite insistence to creditors who believed a woman's signature meant nothing. The necklace came free. She crossed the floor. She did not hurry. She did not weep. She held the necklace out to Desmond with an open palm, and when he finally looked at her, when he was finally forced to meet her eyes, she spoke in a voice so quiet that only he could hear. Then may Blackwell remember who kept its fires burning before it chose new light. She placed the necklace in his hand. She turned. She walked out of the ballroom, while every eye in England's finest gathering watched her go, and she did not look back once. Not at the man she had devoted herself to for 21 years, not at the woman who had taken her place before the chair had even cooled, not at the glittering room she had spent 2 decades making worthy of its name. Outside, snow fell soft and silent over the courtyard. Her carriage waited beneath the lamps, the horses still, their breath curling white in the cold. Louisa stepped into the night. She did not know, then, what her father had left behind. She did not know that the man Desmond had always called a harmless country gentleman had quietly held England together for decades, while powerful men were too proud to ask for help. She did not know that the same lords and ladies who had pitied her in that ballroom tonight would one day rise to their feet and call her name with reverence. She only knew the cold, the snow, the long road home, and the strange feeling, not grief, not quite, that this was not an ending at all. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please subscribe. I'm a new creator, and your support goes a long way. The evening had begun, as so many evenings at Blackwell Hall began, with a kind of effortful perfection. 300 candles burned in the great chandeliers. The kitchen had sent up 7 courses. The housekeeper, Mrs. Clara Holloway, had spent 4 days overseeing the arrangement of flowers, the polishing of silver, and the pressing of table linens, so precisely starched they could have stood alone. Invitations had gone out 6 weeks prior to the families of greatest distinction. The Carringtons from their estate near Hertfordshire, the Prescotts from their London townhouse, the Sterlings, the Lockwoods, the Pembroke cousins who were 3rd in line to an earldom, and very proud of it. Everyone had come. They always came when the Duke of Blackwell called. Louisa had spent the afternoon resting, a luxury she rarely allowed herself, and dressing with more than usual care. Her lady's maid, a quiet young woman named Nell, had arranged her hair with pearl-tipped pins and pressed the silver-blue gown twice, though it did not need it. Louisa had stood before the mirror longer than she normally would, studying the woman she found there. 43 years old. The lines at the corners of her eyes were honest ones, earned through laughter and worry in equal measure. Her dark auburn hair carried a few threads of silver that she had never tried to hide. She was not the youngest woman in any room she entered anymore. She was not the most dazzling, but she had always been the most present. He must see that, she had told herself. After everything, he must. She descended the staircase at 7:15 and found Desmond in the great hall, speaking with Lord Carrington. He glanced up when she appeared. Something in his expression went carefully neutral. "You look well," he said. She had learned over the years to hear the things Desmond did not say. Well meant acceptable. Well meant she would not embarrass him. Well meant he was already thinking about something else. She took her place beside him and greeted their guests with the warmth she had always brought to these evenings. A particular skill of hers, the ability to make each person feel, for the few moments of their conversation, that they were the most important person in the room. Lord Carrington squeezed her hand, and told her the hall had never looked finer. Lady Adelaide Prescott kissed her cheek and said she must share the recipe for the winter rose arrangements, which Louisa had designed herself from dried herbs and late-blooming stems grown in the kitchen garden. "You always make this house feel alive," Adelaide murmured, and Louisa smiled and said it was only flowers. Adelaide gave her a look that said, "It is never only flowers." The evening moved through its stages as grand evenings do. Dinner, wine, movement between rooms, the slow gathering of everyone toward the ballroom for music and conversation, and whatever announcement the Duke had promised. Louisa had heard the word announcement passed between guests in low voices all evening, and she had not let herself hope too specifically, but she had hoped. A gift, perhaps. A public word of thanks, something to mark the years. She had not hoped for this. She had been standing near Desmond's right shoulder, where she always stood, the position she had occupied at every public event for 21 years, close enough to prompt him quietly if a name escaped him, to smooth over an awkward moment, to be the steady thing beside the title, when he raised his glass. And she had listened, and she had understood, not in pieces, all at once, the way comprehension sometimes comes not gradually, but as a single, terrible clarity, the way fog does not thin, but simply lifts. He was going to set her aside. He had already set her aside. The announcement was not a surprise to him. It was not even, she realized slowly, a surprise to many of the people in this room. She could see it in the careful way some faces had arranged themselves, the small signs of pre-knowledge, the slightly too controlled expressions, the way Lord Carrington had gone so still. They had been told, or had suspected, or had simply known Desmond long enough to have expected something like this. She alone had not expected it. 21 years, and she had not expected it. That thought, above all others, was the one that made it hurt. She made herself notice the room. She made herself breathe. She made herself register details the way she had trained herself to do during the difficult early years of the marriage, when Desmond's moods had been unpredictable and she had learned to manage her own emotions by focusing outward, the candles, the music, the faces. Violette Kensington was watching her now. That pale, lovely face was arranged in an expression of sympathetic concern, so studied it had the texture of a painting. The eyes, however, were bright with something else entirely, something that was not sympathy at all. Louisa looked away. She looked instead at Desmond's hand, at the glass he held, at the knuckles that had no tension in them, because he was entirely at ease, because this, for him, was not a rupture. This was simply the next arrangement. She had always known Desmond loved the estate more than he loved her. She had made peace with that, or told herself she had. She had believed, at least, that he respected her, that he recognized what she carried, even if he never thanked her for it. She understood now that she had been wrong about that too. She removed the necklace. The clasp was small and delicate, and her fingers were perfectly steady. She crossed the room slowly, feeling each step on the polished floor, hearing the soft sound of the music stopping, because the musicians, somewhere above, had understood that the mood had changed. She stopped in front of Desmond. He looked at her, finally. His face did something complicated. A flicker of what might have been discomfort, quickly smoothed over. She placed the necklace in his hand. She said her piece, quietly, so only he could hear. She saw the words land in his eyes. Then she turned and walked away from everything she had spent 21 years building, and carried herself through that door with the straightness of a woman who would not let England see her break. The carriage moved through the snow at an even pace. Louisa sat very still inside it, watching the white countryside pass. The lamps swayed. The horses' hooves on the frozen road made a sound like time. Blackwell Hall disappeared behind a fold in the hills, and then there was nothing. No lights, no music, no warm weight of crystal chandeliers. Only the dark and the snow and the long road north toward Hawthorne Cottage, the small property her father had left her, which she had not visited in years. She had not cried. She did not cry now. She pressed the fingers of both hands flat against her knees and looked out the window and thought, with a painful precision, about the moment she had understood. The exact moment. Not the announcement itself, but the second before it, when she had seen Desmond's eyes move to Violette, and warm in a way they had not warmed on Louisa in, she could not remember how long. He had looked at Violette the way he had once looked at her, and she had thought, in that fraction of a second before everything fell, how long has it felt cold between us, and how long have I refused to count? She could count now. She had years enough for it. Hawthorne Cottage was smaller than she remembered. It sat at the end of a lane of bare oak trees, a modest stone house with dark shuttered windows, and a garden that had gone to seed in her long absence. Snow covered everything, the old herb beds her mother had once tended, the low stone wall along the lane, the iron bench beneath the oak tree where Theodore Hawthorne had liked to read on summer afternoons. Louisa arrived just before dawn. She lit the lamps herself. She built the fire herself. She moved through the small, quiet rooms and breathed the air of a house that had once been entirely hers, not Blackwell's, not Desmond's, hers, and felt something strange and fragile stir inside her. Not comfort, not yet, but the possibility of it. She slept poorly the first 2 nights. She woke reaching for a household that was no longer hers, and found only stillness. She lay in her narrow childhood bed and stared at the ceiling and rehearsed things she would never say to anyone. Arguments, accusations, the long, careful list of everything she had sacrificed that Desmond had never bothered to name. By the 3rd day, she was tired of her own grief. She rose early, dressed simply, and decided to clear her father's study. The room had been locked since Theodore's death 7 years ago, preserved by some quiet agreement between herself and the caretaker of the cottage. She had not been ready to go through his things. She had told herself she would return to do it properly, and then life at Blackwell Hall had consumed her, and the years had accumulated, and the study had remained closed. She unlocked it with the key she had always kept on the same ring as her own. The room smelled of cedarwood and old paper, and something faintly floral she could not name, the ghost of a pipe Desmond had always called common, and Theodore had smoked every evening on the front step, regardless. The desk stood at the center of the room, heavy and scratched. Theodore had never replaced it, though Louisa had offered to many times. "A man knows his tools," he had said. "Fancy furniture is for men who have something to prove." The surface was clear. Theodore had always worked with deliberate tidiness. The shelves around the room held books, correspondence boxes, old legal documents in leather folders. Louisa began with the shelves. She worked slowly, reading labels, setting things aside, allowing herself small pauses when she found something that carried his handwriting, his voice. A letter to a tenant farmer, reminding him that the fence repair could wait until spring. A receipt from a bookseller in London, a surprising one, since her father had never mentioned the particular philosophical text listed there. A small pressed flower in a folded card, which bore no inscription, and which she held for a long moment before setting aside. She almost missed it. The drawer at the bottom left of the desk was stiff with age, and when it finally opened, it appeared empty, just a smooth wooden base, a faint smell of lavender. She was about to close it when she noticed the seam. The floor of the drawer did not sit flush with the sides. She pressed her fingers along the edge and felt a catch give beneath the pressure, and the false bottom lifted, and there it was, a sealed letter. Her name on the outside in Theodore's careful handwriting, and a small velvet pouch. Louisa sat very still for a moment, then she broke the seal. "My darling Louisa, if you are reading this, then life has dealt you a blow I spent many years hoping to spare you. I know your heart. I know you have carried things quietly and with great dignity, just as your mother did, just as I tried to. But I also know that quiet people are often asked to carry far more than their share, and I suspect you have been asked to carry considerably more than was fair. There are things I never told you, not because I did not trust you. I trust you more than any person living, but because quiet work is safest when hidden, and because you deserved, for as long as possible, the simple happiness of a life unlayered by my complications. But the time for simplicity has passed, my dear. Enclosed with this letter, you will find my signet ring. You will know it by the crest, a hawthorn branch and a crown, bound together. Take it with you to Carrington House in Hertfordshire, and show it to Lord Augustus Carrington. Tell him only that you are Theodore Hawthorne's daughter. He will understand everything else. I love you more than you know, and I am more proud of you than I ever managed to say properly. Forgive an old man's restraint. Your father Louisa read it twice. Then she set it on the desk and opened the velvet pouch. The signet ring was heavier than she expected. Gold, old and dark with age, bearing the crest exactly as described, a hawthorn branch, fine worked, and above it a simple crown. She had never seen her father wear it. She had never seen it at all. She turned it over in her palm. Lord Augustus Carrington was not a man to be approached lightly. He sat on 3 important committees. His family's name appeared in parliamentary records going back 2 centuries. He was respected, genuinely, not merely by convention, in a way that Desmond had always envied and never quite achieved. Why would Augustus Carrington know anything about Theodore Hawthorne? Her father had been a country gentleman, a reader, a quiet man who grew herbs and smoked on his doorstep and wrote careful letters, and had never, to Louisa's knowledge, moved in any circle that would have brought him within the orbit of a man like Augustus Carrington. She looked at the ring again. She thought about her father's voice, the way it carried a particular weight when he was absolutely certain of something, the way he had never, not once in her memory, spoken without reason. She had trusted him when he was alive. She closed her fingers around the ring. That evening she sat by the window with a cup of cooling tea and watched the lane that led away from Hawthorne Cottage toward the wider road, and she thought about roads and choices and what it meant to be at the beginning of something when you had only just understood that something else had ended. Desmond had called her father harmless so many times she had almost stopped hearing it. A country nobody, he had once said at dinner, not to her, to another gentleman, but she had been in earshot. He had laughed at her father's simplicity, his quiet habits, his lack of ambition. She had said nothing. She had smoothed the moment over, the way she smoothed everything. But she remembered. She set down the tea. She went to bed and lay awake thinking of a hawthorn crest and a crown, and in the morning she asked the caretaker's boy to ready the carriage. Carrington House stood behind iron gates that bore the family crest, a hawk in flight above crossed swords, and the avenue leading to the front door was so long and flanked by such orderly bare-limbed beeches that it felt less like an approach and more like a ceremony. Louisa arrived on a grey Tuesday morning, unannounced, without a plan beyond the ring in her gloved hand and her father's instruction. The butler received her with that particular brand of careful neutrality reserved for unexpected guests of indeterminate social standing, polite, but prepared to redirect. She gave her name and asked to see Lord Carrington on a private matter. The butler's expression managed the considerable feat of remaining perfectly composed while also communicating deep skepticism. She removed the velvet pouch from her bag and opened it just enough for the ring to be visible. The butler disappeared. He returned in under 3 minutes and showed her directly to the library. Lord Augustus Carrington was exactly as she remembered him from the ball, a large, weathered man in his 60s, with a face that had been lived in hard and a bearing that carried real authority rather than the performed kind. He was standing when she entered, which she noticed, because a man like Augustus Carrington did not usually rise for a morning caller he had never invited. He looked at the ring first, then at her face. Then something happened that Louisa had not expected at all. His expression, that composed, experienced face, cracked open, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible from across the room, but up close she saw the shift, the recognition, followed by something much softer. "You are Theodore Hawthorne's daughter," he said. Not a question, an identification, as though he had been expecting her, or someone like her, for a very long time. "I am," she said, "though I confess, I am here because my father instructed me to come, and I don't yet understand why. He gestured to the chairs by the fire. He sat only after she did. How much do you know, he said, about what your father did? He was a country gentleman, Louisa said. He read a great deal and kept a modest garden and loved my mother very much. That is nearly everything I know. Augustus was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire. When he looked back at her, his expression had settled into something deliberate, the expression of a man preparing to tell a truth he has held for a long time. 17 years ago, he said, Carrington House was within 1/4 of total ruin. Louisa waited. Debts, mismanagement from my grandfather's time, that had been papered over and papered over until the paper could no longer hold. Political enemies who saw the weakness and chose that moment to press accusations, false ones, but legal enough to cause damage. I had an infant son. I had a wife who deserved better than what I had brought her to, and I had no idea how to stop it. He paused. He folded his hands. Theodore Hawthorne arrived at this house on a Wednesday evening. He had sent no letter in advance. He came alone, without servants, in a hired coach. He sat in the chair you are sitting in now, and told me, calmly and precisely, that he knew the exact nature of my situation, that he had a plan to address it, and that he required nothing from me in return, except my discretion. Louisa felt something shift inside her chest. He negotiated directly with our 3 largest creditors, Augustus continued. He exposed the men responsible for the false accusations through channels I still do not entirely understand. He arranged an agreement with a banking house in Edinburgh that stabilized our accounts for the following decade. He did all of this without a single conversation in a drawing room, without a single mention in any newspaper, without any of the social machinery that men of my position use to solve such problems. He stopped. He would not take payment, he said. I tried. He refused. He said only that England had enough men who collected debts and too few who resolved them, and that he preferred to be useful. The fire crackled. Louisa sat very still, turning this over carefully. She thought of her father at his study desk. She thought of the correspondence boxes on his shelves, the legal folders she had not yet opened. She thought of his handwriting, careful, precise, the hand of a man who understood that words had consequences. How many families? She asked. That he helped. Yes. Augustus looked at her steadily. A great many. I know of 7 in some detail, because those families shared information privately. I suspect there are more I don't know about. And no one spoke of it? He asked for discretion. Men like Theodore Hawthorne. Men who do the work without wanting the credit. They earn a very particular kind of loyalty, the kind that stays quiet until it is asked to speak. He reached into the desk behind him and withdrew a bundle of letters tied with dark ribbon. He also left instructions, he said. In the event that his daughter came to me with the signet ring, I was to give her these. He held them out. She took them. It was there, in the Carrington Library, that Lord Sebastian Carrington found them an hour later. He entered with the particular purposefulness of a man who has been told something important is happening and has come to assess whether he is needed. He was perhaps 35, tall, dark-haired, with his father's steadiness and something else underneath it, something more still. He had the quality of a man who listened before he spoke, which was rarer than it should have been. He stopped when he saw Louisa. Something in his face went careful and attentive in the way a person goes quiet when they suddenly understand the weight of a room. Sebastian, Augustus said, this is Miss Louisa Hawthorne, Theodore's daughter. Sebastian inclined his head. His eyes moved over her face with a directness that was not rude, more like the directness of someone who wants to see clearly, rather than the directness of someone who wants to be seen looking. I know who she is, he said. I was at the Blackwell ball. A silence. Louisa felt the familiar tension of being recognized in that particular way, the discarded duchess, her shame arriving before her like an announcement. But Sebastian did not look at her with pity. He looked at her the way Augustus had, with something closer to recognition. I'm glad you came, he said simply. Your father was an exceptional man. She did not know why that simple sentence, without performance or elaboration, was the thing that made her throat tighten. She managed a small, composed nod and returned her attention to the letters. Later, when Augustus was called briefly out of the room and she was left alone with the bundle of correspondence and the fire, Sebastian brought her tea without being asked, without making a production of it, setting it close to her hand and moving the papers slightly so she would not have to reach past them. She noticed her hands were trembling. He said nothing about it. He sat in the opposite chair and read the book he had brought with him, and the silence between them was of the kind that does not demand filling. She thought, this is what it feels like when someone sees you and does not decide what to do with what they see. The thought came and went quickly. She was not ready for it yet. She folded it away somewhere careful and returned to her father's letters. At Blackwell Hall, spring came late and brought no warmth. Lady Violette Kensington had become the Duchess of Blackwell by private arrangement, pending the formal proceedings, and she had moved into the hall's east wing with 17 trunks, a lady's maid she had brought from London, and a certainty that her natural charm would handle whatever complexity a great estate required. It had not yet handled anything. The tenants arrived first. A family named Whitmore came on a Tuesday, the father and eldest son, hats in hand, asking to see the new Duchess about a collapsed section of the grain barn's roof, an old problem, one that Louisa had flagged twice in the estate ledger and arranged for spring inspection. Violette received them in the morning room, which was already an error, though she did not know it. Louisa had always received tenants in the estate office, where the relevant records were at hand, and the atmosphere was businesslike rather than social. The father explained the damage, the cost of repair, the loss of winter stores, the difficulty of carrying the debt into planting season. Violette listened with visible discomfort, and then said, pleasantly, "Surely these things are managed by the steward." "Mr. Holloway sent us to you, Your Grace," the son said. "Then perhaps Mr. Holloway has made an error," Violette said, and smiled in a way that was meant to be charming and arrived as dismissal. They left without resolution. Mr. Leonard Holloway heard about it within the hour and said nothing to anyone, but his expression, observed by several of the senior servants, was the expression of a man revising his expectations significantly downward. In the kitchen, Mrs. Clara Holloway, who had kept Blackwell Hall in meticulous order for 16 of the 21 years Louisa had been Duchess, made the pantry orders that evening with the particular efficiency of a woman who has decided not to feel what she is feeling until after the work is done. The new Duchess had requested 7 specific items for the week's menus. 4 of them were inappropriate to the season, 1 was unavailable from their regular supplier, and 2 conflicted with the dietary restrictions of the Lockwood guests expected Thursday. Louisa had always reviewed the menus herself, a task she had taken on in the 3rd year of the marriage when she discovered that the previous housekeeper was allowing the kitchen budget to drift. Clara adjusted the orders. She absorbed the discrepancy. She said nothing, but later, washing her hands at the kitchen basin, she allowed herself one thought, just one. She would have caught this before breakfast. It was Holloway, Leonard, the steward, who finally said something to Desmond. Not directly, and not about Violette's shortcomings. Leonard Holloway had been steward at Blackwell Hall for 11 years, and he understood, as all capable stewards must, the difference between what he was permitted to say and what he was permitted to imply. He came to Desmond with the quarterly accounts. He laid them out carefully, with all the explanations attached. He pointed, without emphasis, to the places where systems had lapsed. The winter tenant review, which Louisa had conducted every November, the charitable distribution fund, which Louisa had established and quietly administered, the correspondence file with the 3 political ministers with whom Desmond's name needed to remain in careful standing, all handled always by Louisa, whose letters were so precisely calibrated that the ministers had consistently praised Desmond's thoughtfulness without knowing they were praising his wife's. Desmond looked at the papers. "These things will need to be reassigned," he said. "Yes, Your Grace," Holloway said. "I wanted to be certain you understood the scope of what needs reassigning." Desmond looked at him. How much of this was she managing? Holloway paused. A careful pause. The pause of a man assembling the most honest answer that will not get him dismissed. "Nearly all of it, Your Grace," he said, in one form or another. Desmond said nothing. He looked at the accounts for a long time after Holloway left. That evening, at dinner, he watched Violette describe a ball she wished to host in May. The invitations, the gowns, the menu of imported dishes that would create a great impression. And he felt, for the first time, a coldness that had nothing to do with the season. He had always known, abstractly, that Louisa worked. He had not understood that Blackwell Hall was her work. Meanwhile, Louisa was in the library at Carrington House for the 4th morning running. The letters her father had left were extensive, more extensive than she had imagined. They were not a simple collection of thank-you notes. They were a map. Theodore had documented everything, quietly and methodically. The families he had helped, the nature of each crisis, the resolution, the names of the men who had threatened harm, and the legal instruments used to counter them. He had kept records of every arrangement, every correspondence, every silent negotiation, conducted in drawing rooms and private offices across England. He had also left instructions for Louisa specifically, not vague gestures, specific ones, which families to contact, which documents to retrieve from which solicitors, which trusts had been established in her name. Trusts. There was more than Louisa had known. Her father had not been a wealthy man by Blackwell's measure, but he had been a careful one, and over many decades of quiet service, the gratitude of England's great families had compounded into something real. Property, endowments, charitable funds that bore the Hawthorne name, administered by a solicitor in London who had been waiting, patiently, for Louisa to appear. She sat in the Carrington library and turned pages for hours. Sebastian came and went. He brought things when she needed them, not intrusively, not performatively, but with a quiet practicality that she was beginning to associate with his particular character. On the 2nd afternoon, she had asked him why he was spending so much of his time in the library when she suspected he had a great deal of other work. He had looked at her with a slight tilt of his head, as if considering whether to answer directly. "Because someone should be here," he said, "while you do this. Someone who isn't serving another interest." She had not known what to say to that. She was 35 years out of practice, with kindness that asked nothing in return. On the 4th evening, as the carriage took her back to Hawthorne Cottage, she sat in the dark and thought about her father. Not about the letters, not about the revelation of the trusts and the families and the hidden network, but about the man himself, about the way he had smoked his pipe on the front step, about the way he had listened, really listened, when she spoke, about the way he had looked at her, always, as though she were something valuable. She had married Desmond partly because he had first looked at her that way. He had stopped, at some point. She could not name the year. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the carriage window and watched the dark countryside go by and let herself feel, briefly, the grief of understanding that her father had known, had always known, what she was worth, while the man she had given 21 years to had forgotten to count. Then she straightened. She had work to do. The gathering in the Carrington Library took place on a Thursday morning in early March. Lord Augustus had invited Lady Adelaide Prescott and Sir Benedict Stirling, and the 5 of them, Augustus, Adelaide, Benedict, Sebastian, and Louisa, sat around the large central table, with Theodore's papers spread between them, while snow tapped softly at the high windows. It was, Louisa thought, the most significant meeting she had ever attended. She had attended a great many: Blackwell estate meetings, political dinners, charity committees, but those had always been meetings where she was present by association, by title, by the complicated courtesy extended to a duke's wife. This meeting was about her name. The feeling was unfamiliar enough that it took her some time to settle into it. Adelaide Prescott was a small, precise woman in her 50s, with iron-grey hair and the particular confidence of someone who has survived a great deal and documented it carefully. She had brought her own folder of letters. "I will tell you what Theodore did for my family," she said, without preamble, because Adelaide had never seen the value of preambles. My husband's brother made a false legal claim against my children's inheritance when my husband died. He had powerful friends in the legal profession. I had a widow's allowance and 4 children under 12. She opened her folder. Theodore identified the fraudulent instrument in the claim within a week of my writing to him. He located 3 witnesses who had been persuaded to stay silent and managed to persuade them otherwise. He submitted the counter-evidence through a solicitor in Edinburgh, which meant the case could not be heard by the judge my brother-in-law had arranged. The claim was dismissed. She closed the folder. He refused payment. He refused public acknowledgement. He said only that a man who would steal from orphans had already stolen enough, and that he preferred the satisfaction of stopping it to the satisfaction of being thanked. Benedict Sterling, a compact man with an MP's practiced composure, nodded. My situation was different, but no less serious. I was newly elected, sitting on a committee that was investigating a group of men who did not want to be investigated. They found something in my past, a debt from my university years, poorly managed, nearly forgotten, and used it to threaten my position. He paused. Theodore handled it before it became public. I still don't know, entirely, how. I know he spent 6 weeks working on it. I know the men who threatened me quietly withdrew. I know my career survived. He looked at Louisa. I spoke to him once, directly, after it was resolved. He told me that England had enough problems without its better men being taken out of service by its worse ones. He was completely matter-of-fact about it, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Louisa looked at the papers on the table. The ledger her father had kept, a large, plain-covered book, filled with his careful handwriting, lay open before her. She had spent days reading it. She understood, now, the structure of what he had built. It was not merely charitable intervention. It was a system. Theodore had created a network of trust that operated below the surface of English society, in the spaces between formal power structures, in the invisible connections between grateful people who knew that someone had been there when no one else was. He had identified need with extraordinary accuracy. He had acted quickly and quietly. He had asked for nothing except that the people he helped behave better than the circumstances that had threatened them. He had been building this for 30 years. Louisa felt the full weight of it settle. He never told me, she said, not as an accusation, as a recognition. He told very few people anything, Augustus said. That was the design. Quiet work is safe work. Gratitude that is not performed in public cannot be taken away. He sounds, Sebastian said, from his quiet position at the end of the table, like a man who understood that most people in difficulty are there because someone with power chose to put them there, and that the appropriate response is to remove the power. There was a short silence. That is a very exact description of him, Adelaide said. The papers also revealed something Louisa had not expected. The Royal Benefactors' Assembly in London, scheduled for the first week of April, had long been a venue where Theodore's network, the families he had helped, the ministers he had worked with, the judges and bankers and senior solicitors who moved through his quiet machinery, gathered under the official banner of charitable work and civic recognition. Theodore had helped establish the Assembly's charitable trust 20 years prior. It bore, in the archival records, a small notation that few had ever examined. Founding patron, T.J. Hawthorne. He had built the table, and then he had stepped away from it and let others sit. The Assembly's committee had been waiting, patiently, for someone to arrive with the signet ring and the name. Louisa was invited to attend. The invitation arrived at Hawthorne Cottage on a Saturday morning. It was addressed, not to Duchess Blackwell, not to the former Duchess of anything, but to Miss Louisa Hawthorne, daughter of Theodore Hawthorne, founding patron. She read it 3 times. She set it on the windowsill. She stood in her father's garden in the cold March air and breathed for a long time. In London, word had already begun to move through certain drawing rooms. This was, Louisa would later understand, inevitable. When a name begins to be spoken among people who know the weight it carries, it spreads in the particular way that significant things spread. Not loudly, not in newspapers, but in the careful exchanges between people who have reason to pay attention. Theodore Hawthorne's daughter has been received at Carrington House. She has been in correspondence with the Assembly's committee. They say she has the papers. Desmond heard the name spoken, for the first time, at his club. A man he respected, a senior MP whose company Desmond had spent years cultivating, mentioned, in passing, that he was looking forward to seeing Miss Hawthorne at the Assembly. "Hawthorne?" Desmond said. "Louisa Hawthorne," the MP said. "Theodore's girl. Remarkable man, Theodore. Do you know, I sat on a matter 20 years ago that he resolved almost single-handedly, entirely without credit. She's inherited his papers, apparently. The Assembly's very pleased. They've been without a Hawthorne for 7 years." Desmond smiled and nodded, and said something agreeable, and spent the rest of the evening turning this over in his mind. He had lived beside Louisa for 21 years. He had never once thought to ask about her father. At Blackwell Hall, Violette's dinner party went badly. The invitations had been beautiful. The table had been dressed magnificently. The imported dishes had been extraordinary. Violette was certain of that, though she had planned the menus without consulting the kitchen regarding seasonal availability, and 3 of the 7 courses had required urgent substitution. But the real problem was the guest list. Several families Violette had expected, the Carringtons, the Prescotts, the Sterlings, had sent regrets. Polite ones, unassailable ones. They were attending another engagement, each letter said. Violette did not know, yet, what that engagement was, but Desmond did. He had heard, by then, that the Carrington Library had hosted a gathering of some of England's most respected families, and that Louisa Hawthorne had sat at the center of it. He looked at his dinner table, the elegant, expensive, beautiful table that Violette had arranged with such pride, and felt the particular discomfort of a man who is beginning to understand the consequence of his own errors, but is not yet ready to name them. The Royal Benefactors' Assembly was held in a hall of considerable grandeur in the heart of London. Red velvet curtains reached to the ceiling. Marble columns flanked the central floor. Portraits of England's historic charitable benefactors lined the walls in gilded frames, and above them all, carved into the stone of the entrance arch, were the Assembly's founding words, "In service to those who cannot serve themselves." Desmond arrived early, as he usually did at events of this scale, a habit born of the desire to be seen in position rather than entering. He brought Violette, who wore her finest emerald gown, and received compliments on it with practiced gratitude. He spoke to the men he knew. He circulated with the ease of a man who had attended 100 such gatherings, but something felt different. He could not, at first, identify it. The room was full, the company was distinguished, the evening had all the correct features of a significant assembly, and yet, he kept hearing the name. "Has Miss Hawthorne arrived? I understand she'll speak tonight. Has the committee confirmed? Carrington said she has all the original papers, every one of them. Theodore's daughter. Have you met her? Extraordinary woman." Desmond moved through the room, and the name followed him, ahead of him, everywhere. He stopped beside a man he knew from Parliament, a senior minister, someone who would not normally engage in idle social curiosity, and found the minister craning his neck toward the entrance doors. "Expecting someone?" Desmond said. "Theodore Hawthorne's daughter," the minister said. "I owe that man more than I can say in a room this public. I want to pay my respects to her before the evening gets away." "You knew Theodore Hawthorne," Desmond said. The minister looked at him with mild surprise. "You didn't?" he said. "But surely, was she not your wife?" The word arrived like cold water, was. The minister moved away to greet another acquaintance, and Desmond stood holding his wineglass and feeling, for the first time, the specific shape of what he had thrown away. The hall went quieter when the doors opened. Not silent, nothing so dramatic as that, but the particular temperature of a room can change without anyone announcing it, and the temperature of this room changed when Louisa Hawthorne entered. She wore deep emerald, dark, rich, the color of old forest and winter pine. The gown was simple, no elaborate trim, no jeweled excess. It needed none of that. She wore a single strand of pearls, her father's, which she had found in a box in the cottage and cleaned carefully for this evening. Her hair was dressed high, a few copper threads catching the light. She entered with Lord Augustus Carrington on her left and Lady Adelaide Prescott on her right. Behind them came Sir Benedict Stirling and Sebastian Carrington, who walked with the particular calm of people who are exactly where they are meant to be. Desmond watched from across the room. He watched people move toward her. He watched the instinctive courtesy extended, not the social courtesy of rank and title, but something different, something that looked more like genuine regard. He watched men who had spent decades building their reputations seek her out and speak to her with unmistakable respect. He watched her receive it all, with ease, with warmth, with the natural grace of a woman who has come home to something she did not know she was inheriting. She did not see him, or if she did, she gave no sign. Lord Augustus spoke first. He stood before the assembly with the weight of a man who has prepared this particular speech for 17 years and finally has occasion to deliver it. Theodore James Hawthorne, he said, never sat on any committee. He never held office. He never wrote a single word for any newspaper or publication. And yet, there are men and women in this room who would not be standing here tonight if he had not chosen, quietly and without any obligation, to stand between them and their ruin. The room was very still. He saved Carrington House, Augustus said. He saved it when it should not have been saved, when the situation was beyond what any conventional remedy could reach, and he did it without asking for anything in return, except decency. He looked at Louisa. His daughter is in this room tonight, and I wish England to know her name. Adelaide spoke next. She told her story as she told everything, directly, precisely, without sentiment, which somehow made it more affecting than sentiment would have been. She described the false legal claim, the threat to her children, the moment Theodore had appeared, unrequested, with a solution. He told me, she said, that England's widows were owed better than the mercy of men who had made the laws that left them defenseless. He was right. He was always right. Benedict Stirling stood. He was brief. He did not describe his debt in detail, only acknowledged it, and acknowledged that Theodore had rescued something England needed more than it knew at the time. Then others, a judge from the Northern Circuit, who had kept his appointment because Theodore had exposed the manipulation intended to remove him, a banking solicitor whose young firm had survived a predatory hostile takeover because Theodore had identified the instruments of fraud 3 weeks before they were deployed, a countess whose late husband's debts had been quietly settled by a mechanism Theodore had designed that cost his personal reserves considerably. One by one, the room listened. Desmond stood very still. He had been here, in one way or another, adjacent to this name, for 21 years. He had sat at Louisa's table and dismissed her father as an unremarkable man. He had never asked a single question. He had never thought there was anything to ask. He looked at Louisa now. She was standing beside her father's oldest friend, listening to these testimonies with an expression he could not entirely read. Emotion, yes, but underneath it, something steadier, something that looked like recognition, like a woman discovering that the ground beneath her feet was more solid than she had been allowed to believe. When the assembly asked her to speak, she stepped forward without hesitation. She thanked them, simply. She spoke about her father, not the newly revealed Theodore of letters and legacies and hidden networks, but the man she had known, the pipe smoke on the doorstep, the worn desk, the pressed flower she still could not explain. She said he had taught her, by example, that the measure of a person was not what they were given, but what they chose to do when someone else needed them. He chose to be useful, she said, when it was difficult, and when it was invisible, and when it cost him. I hope, in the years ahead, to be worthy of that choice. The room rose for her, not for a title, not for an estate, not for a connection to power, for her name, for her father's name, which had become, in this room, the same thing. Desmond rose with the rest, slowly. His hands were clapping, before he had consciously decided to clap. He stood and watched the woman he had discarded become, in the span of an evening, unforgettable. Violette, beside him, was very quiet. He glanced at her and saw in her face a recognition he had not expected there, the understanding that she had not replaced a faded woman. She had stepped into the shadow of someone far greater than she had imagined. The full weight of that settled over the room like weather. After the assembly, the reception moved into the adjoining hall, and Louisa was surrounded for an hour, people approaching with quiet words, letters of gratitude for her father, expressions of hope for the continuation of his work. She received all of it with warmth. She remembered each face. She gave each person the particular attention her father had always given, the real kind, not the performed kind. When a window in the crowd appeared, she slipped through a side door and found a balcony. The night air was cold and sharp. London lay below and beyond, gas lamps along the river, the dark shapes of buildings, a sky without stars but bright at the edges, with the diffuse glow of a city that never fully slept. She stood at the railing and breathed. She heard the door open behind her. She did not turn around immediately, because she knew the step. It was a step she had heard daily for 21 years. Desmond came to stand a few feet away from her, not beside her. He looked out over the city. "I did not know," he said, not as an excuse, as an admission. "No," she agreed. "I should have." She said nothing. It was true, and they both knew it, and there was nothing to add. "Your father came to our wedding," Desmond said. "He sat in the third row. I shook his hand. I thought he was a pleasant enough man for a country gentleman. I remember thinking his coat was slightly out of fashion." He stopped. Something in his face moved. He was probably solving 2 crises that same weekend, he said. "And I remember his coat. He wouldn't have minded," Louisa said, and she was surprised to find that was entirely true. "He wouldn't have wanted you to know. He would have been glad you were happy." "Were you happy?" Desmond said. A long pause. "For a time," she said. "Yes, for a time I was." He turned to look at her then. She met his gaze. She did not look away, and she did not soften what he could see there. The full accounting of it, the cost of it, the thing that 21 years of love, worn down to loyalty, worn down to habit, had looked like from the inside. I took you for granted," he said. "I know that is not sufficient to say." "No," she said. "It isn't. I mistook your quietness for contentment. I thought because you managed everything without complaint, you required nothing. I don't know what I thought, Louisa. I think I stopped thinking about it at some point, and that was the real failure." She looked back at the city. "I kept your house alive," she said, not angrily. "As a fact, I managed your tenants and your accounts, and your reputation, and your relationships with people who might otherwise have decided they disliked you. I did it quietly, the way my father did quiet things, because I believed it was what love required." She paused. "I was wrong about what love requires," she said. "Or rather, I was right that love requires work. I was wrong that it only goes one way." The silence between them was heavy and honest. "I would like to ask you to come back," he said. "I know I have no right to ask it." "You're right," she said gently. "You don't." He said nothing. "I forgive you," she said. "I want you to know that, because I refuse to carry it, and because I think you are capable of understanding what you've done and of doing better." Violette may be surprised to find she has a husband who has finally learned to pay attention. Something moved across his face. Not quite hope, something more complicated. "But I am not going back," she said. "Not because I am punishing you, because I have spent 21 years building a life around what you needed and what you required, and what Blackwell Hall demanded, and what England's finest society expected of a duchess. And for the first time, for the very first time, I am building something around what I am worth." She said it without anger. She said it as a woman who has arrived, finally, at her own name. Desmond was quiet for a long time. "I hope," he said at last, "that whoever helps you build it understands what they have." "He seems to," Louisa said. She had not meant to say that, but she did not take it back. Desmond nodded once. He looked at her for a moment longer, and in his eyes she saw, for the first time in years, perhaps the last time, the younger man he had once been. The man who had looked at her across a garden 30 years ago and thought her worth knowing. Then he left. She stood at the railing a while longer. Sebastian found her there. He did not ask if she was all right. He came to stand beside her at the railing and looked out at London and was quiet in the way that he was always quiet, fully, without apology, without filling the silence with things it did not need. After a while, she said, "He asked me to go back." "I thought he might," Sebastian said. "I said no. I thought you might." She looked at him. There was something in his profile, in the stillness of it, that she had been turning over in her mind for weeks. Since the library, since the tea he had moved without comment, since the afternoons when he had simply been present without requiring anything from her presence. She thought about the hunger she had not let herself name. Not a simple thing, not the quick heat of admiration or the surface pull of attraction. Though those were there, she was honest enough to admit it. This was something slower, something that had built over weeks of conversation, of being listened to, of being valued not for what she managed or performed, but for how she thought. The wanting of it was deep and unfamiliar, and she recognized, distantly, that it frightened her. "What do you want?" he said, not pressingly, with the ease of a man who is genuinely asking. "I don't know yet," she said. "I spent 21 years knowing exactly what was required of me. I am still learning what I want." "That seems right," he said. "Learning something that size takes time." She looked back at the city. "My father built something," she said. "Something quiet and important and real. I want to continue it, not as a memorial to him, as something in its own right. The trust, the work, the families he helped. There are more people who need what he provided. I think I know how to do it. I think you do too," Sebastian said, without any inflection that suggested he was placating her. "I'm going to need people around me who understand what the work requires," she said. "People who are used to doing things without public credit. People who know the difference between power and service." "I know a few," he said. She almost smiled. "I know you do." Another silence, warmer than the night air. "I would like," he said, carefully, "to ask if you would permit me to walk beside you, in whatever direction you choose, not ahead of you. Not making decisions on your behalf. Beside you." She turned to look at him fully. His face was honest in the lamplight. No calculation, no performance, only the directness she had come to recognize as his particular quality. The willingness to say the true thing without dressing it. She thought about the quality of his attention over these past weeks, the way he listened when she spoke, not as though waiting for his turn to respond, but as though her words had weight that he wanted to understand before adding to. She thought about the warmth she had been carefully ignoring, the way her body had catalogued his nearness when he sat across from her in the library, the clean scent of him, the quiet surety of his movements, the startling sensation of being near someone who made the air feel steadier rather than charged with requirement. She thought, "I am 43 years old and I have forgotten that desire is not always danger." She took his hand. She did not make a speech. She did not explain herself. She simply took his hand and held it, the two of them standing at the railing while London moved below, and the night pressed gently around them. He turned his palm up and held her hand back, and neither of them said anything at all for a while, and the silence was not empty. It was full. It was the fullest silence she had occupied in longer than she could name. Months later, at Hawthorne House, the cottage no longer, but a properly restored residence, modest but beautiful, the garden reclaimed, the study made into an office for the Hawthorne Trust. Louisa stood in the morning light with a letter in her hand. It was from a solicitor in Edinburgh, confirming a matter of estate entitlement she had spent 2 months resolving for a young widow with 3 children and a brother-in-law who had believed the law was on his side. The matter was resolved. The children's inheritance was secure. The brother-in-law had withdrawn. Theodore would have approved of the method. And the outcome, Sebastian was in the study. She could hear the muffled sound of his correspondence, the scratch of his pen. He had established himself there over the past months, with the natural ease of someone who fits a place the way a key fits a lock. Not intrusively, not by claiming, but by belonging. Outside the sitting-room window, the garden lay in early summer warmth. Rose bushes climbed the south wall. The old iron bench beneath the oak tree held a book someone had left there, face down, against all Louisa's carefully expressed opinions about book spines. She smiled. She turned her father's signet ring over in her other hand. She wore it on a chain now, close to her chest. She looked at the Hawthorne crest and the crown, and thought about the man who had worn it only in secret, only in private, only in the spaces where the real work was done. She thought about what she had understood, finally, about both of them. Quiet people are not small people. They are not interchangeable. They are not replaceable. They are not absent from the world simply because the world has not yet learned to see what they carry. Her worth had never depended on Desmond's love, though she had spent 21 years believing it did. It had never depended on a title, or a ballroom, or a sapphire necklace, or society's willingness to applaud. It had always been in the quiet work, the careful thought, the patient hands at the ledger, the steady voice with the tenant, the letter that smoothed the thing that should not have been rough, the grace that kept another person standing when they might have fallen. It had always been in her name. She slipped the letter into the folder on the desk, picked up her pen, and began the next one. Sometimes the people who fail to see your value are not proof that you are small. They are only proof that they could not see clearly. Louisa believed her story ended the night Desmond chose someone else. She thought she was walking out of a ballroom into silence. But sometimes the moment someone walks away is the moment you finally begin to walk forward, into your own name, into your own worth, into everything that was always, quietly, faithfully, truly, yours.